Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. Today I'm going to be going over um, international sanctions in South Africa, focusing on South Africa during the apartheid. We'll look into what sanctions were imposed, how they affected the economy, politics, and society. And we'll also discuss whether these sanctions were considered legitimate. By the end, you'll see how sanctions were both a powerful tool and a subjective tool. So let's start off with what exactly are international sanctions? Simply put, they are a measure that a country or international organizations use to influence another country's behavior. These can include trade restrictions, freezing assets, banning weapons, or even cultural and sports boycotts. The goal is to create pressure without using military force. In the case of South Africa, sanctions became a key tool because traditional diplomatic efforts had failed to stop the apartheid. The idea was to essentially not have to take drastic measures to get the apartheid to essentially control themselves. However, this did uh, fail to produce change. Next, uh, apartheid in the South Africa. Apartheid was a system of racial segregation that lasted from 1948 to 1944. It legally separated white South Africans from black South Africans, restricting where they could live, work, and go to school. Black South Africans couldn't vote and faced harsh social economic discrimination. By the 1970s and 1980s, these policies drew uh, global problems, and countries around the world started looking for ways to pressure the South African government to change. They were extremely harsh and violent at times to black Africans, and they limited their voting, limited their education, and their health care as well. Uh, and this was all going on when the rest of the world had already started to reject racism after World War II. The United States was already steering away, or mostly away, from segregation and racism. So, next I'll go into the types of sanctions that were imposed. Sanctions came in several forms. Economically, countries stopped trading with South Africa or pulled out their investments. Culturally, South Africa was banned from participating in international sports events and academy exchanges. Politically, governments refused to maintain full diplomatic relations. Together, these measures were designed to put pressure on South African government while sending a clear moral message against the apartheid. So, this was the way to make the apartheid realize that they were wrong and the rest of the world did not like what they were doing. Like I said in the previous slide, especially because the rest of the world was veering away from racism. And to they didn't feel the need to go into South Africa and invade or take drastic measures and even violent measures. Next is economic impact of the sanctions. Sanctions had a significant impact on South African economy. Foreign companies withdrew investments, trade decreased, and South African rand lost value. Inflation went up, and some industries struggled to survive. However, the wealthier white population was largely insulted from the full effects, while poorer communities faced the brunt uh, of the economic strain. Overall, sanctions created financial pressure that the government could not completely ignore. This was the plan all along with the sanctions to hopefully make the white South Africans realize that what they were doing is wrong and that they need to change their way of thinking. Um, However, some do argue that the wealthier white population uh, was mainly just insulted but did not really care about the consequences. Next, I'll go into political and social impact. Sanctions also affected South Africa politically and socially. They strengthened the position of anti apartheid activists inside the country because the world was showing support for their struggle. The government became increasingly isolated internally, making it harder to defend its policies. This combination of internal resistance and external pressure helped push the country towards change. So, the pressure inside and out that South Africa had helped push the apartheid out, mainly because nobody was supporting them anymore, and it made it harder for them to keep their policies in place, and also people stopped respecting their policies and following their laws, rightfully so. So, next I'll go into arguments of legitimacy. Supporters of sanctions argue that they were a legitimate tool. They were not nonviolent and aimed to protect human rights and aligned with United Nations resolutions condemning apartheid. Leaders like Nelson Mandela even supported sanctions, seeing them as an important part of pressuring the government to dismantle apartheid. From this perspective, sanctions were both ethical and effective. So, in simple terms, everybody supported it, including Nelson Mandela, who later became their president, and saw it as a good thing that South Africa was struggling and suffering to send a message. Next, I'll get into arguments against legitimacy. On the other hand, some critics questioned the legitimacy of sanctions. They argued that sanctions sometimes hurt unorderly South Africans more than the government. Hurt ordinary South Africans more than the government. Prices went up, unemployment increased, and poor communities suffered. Others questioned whether sanctions were directly aimed at the apartheid or just aimed at South Africa in general. Finally, some sanctions interfered with a country's internal affairs, raising concerns about national sovereignty. So, again, in simple terms, this basically meant that the apartheid was not the only one suffering, it was South Africa in general, including poor people, black people, and everybody who was in the country at the time. The outcomes of the sanctions. Despite these debates, sanctions played an important role in ending the apartheid. They added economic and political pressure on the government, strengthened internal support for the anti apartheid movement, and showed South Africa that its policies were unacceptable globally. While sanctions alone did not end apartheid, they were an important piece of a larger struggle for justice and equality. And then I'll head into my conclusion. In conclusion, the international sanctions were a complex but powerful tool. They created economic and political pressure, um, and also sent a global message to the apartheid. They helped push South Africa towards change. While there were some drawbacks, including harm to ordinary citizens, sanctions were generally seen as a legitimate and morally necessary form of international pressure. So, not only most people can agree that the sanctions did help out. However, like I stated before, there were some drawbacks, including harm to ordinary citizens. They were generally seen as legitimate and morally necessary. However, not everybody's going to agree with the same thing. And yeah, this is my presentation. Thank you so much for watching.